their war expenses again through money instead of borrowing or taxing. Lots of people die. Eventually, the war ends. Go see Lincoln. And that union is preserved. A house divided against itself cannot stand, so on and so on and so on. Take History 7b or 7a, whichever one it is, and you can talk about the Civil War in more detail. I'm skipping it. That's it. That's all I'm talking about in the Civil War. Now I'm jumping to post-Civil War. So what do we know about after the Civil War? Well, if we look at the South after the Civil War, we've got this issue where the South's income as a share of the U.S. income on the eve of the Civil War, Southern income per capita is about 72% of U.S. income per capita. This per capita includes everybody, free and slave. That falls in the next, well, it's 2 decades based on the census numbers. That falls to 51%. So the Southern states wind up much worse off post-Civil War than they were relative to the rest of the country than they were before the Civil War. The Civil War is 1861 to 1865. So when we compare pre-Civil War antebellum to post-Civil War postbellum, the South has seen a huge drop from 72% of the U.S. average to 51% of the U.S. average. So one question that's asked is why did Southern income drop so much in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War? The second question is why did it take basically a century for the South to recover? It's relatively not hot, 73%. So why did it take a century for the South to recover back to where it had been on the eve of the Civil War? And then it takes another half century for the South to pull even with the rest of the country. So we're going to really focus on those two questions. Why the drop, 1860 to 1880? And then why does it take a full century for the South to come back? Peter. It could be, but a big part of the story. So we know in the South during the Civil War there's a lot of destruction of capital. We know there was Sherman's March to the Sea. We know there's a lot of land that's been scorched. We know that there's a lot of buildings that have been destroyed. But the really big part of the story for the South is the decline in labor force participation. That the drop in Southern income relative to the rest of the country is explained also by this drop in labor force participation. What we have in the South is the land that had been plantation land. So this shows you Bennett Barrow's plantation. Bennett Barrow's plantation was a plantation studied by Fogel and Ingerman. This is the plantation in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. So look at how that's not a square, by the way. See what a weird shape that is? And there's the road that goes through. So here's the house quarters, and here's the gin house. That's not gin as in vodka, but gin as in cotton gin. And then all this is the cotton lands. And then afterwards, what happens? So the slaves who had lived in the house quarters are now, many of them are still living on the same land as free individuals with their own houses scattered around. This is 20 years later. Many of them having been given Barrow's last name as their last name, and are farming small parts of the land that had been the Bennett plantation. So Bennett still owns all of this land. Bennett all of a sudden no longer has the slave labor force, but he still has the land. He still has the gin house, which is still here someplace. There it is, gin house. And so what happens is that in many places, there's not this huge migration of the black population away from where they had been. There's just a reconfiguration. So the individuals are still living where they had been living. They may be living on the same plantation. They're probably not living in slave quarters. They're probably living in shacks. These are not like nice houses. They're probably living in shacks on the plantation scattered around. And what are they doing? They're cotton farming. All right, so the big drop. One big piece of the big drop is the decline in labor force participation. Work by Richard Such and Roger Ransom in their book, One Kind of Freedom. They estimate from various records what's happened to the labor force participation rate of the individuals who had been enslaved and are now free. Remember, labor force participation, L over P, is one of our measures that gives us determinants of output per capita. The participation rate, the first line, this is all in your handouts from last week. The first line measures what percentage of the population is working. So are you working the farm? Are you picking cotton? The second line measures how many days per year. Is there any change in the number of days per year? You have been working 6.5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. Are you still working 6.5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year? And the third line measures how many hours per day. Are we still working sun up to sundown? Or are there fewer hours per day? And then there's a combination. It's not an additive effect. It's a multiplicative effect of these three factors that gives us a cumulative effect on what's happened to the labor supply in the postbellum South. As a result of freedom, there is somewhere between the high estimate is 37, the low estimate is 28, so let's say around a third. There's around a one-third drop in labor force participation. This is the result of the choice as opposed to the force. So when people have a choice and can choose not to work up until the moment they give birth and then go right back into the fields afterwards, if they can choose not to work in the fields when they're 3 years or 4 years or 5 years old, if they can choose not to work in the fields when they are old, very, very old and having trouble walking, let alone picking, then the choice is exercised. And so the evidence that Ransom and such have give us about a one-third drop in labor supply following emancipation. That one-third drop in labor supply following emancipation goes a long way towards explaining the drop in Southern income as a share of U.S. income. It's a really important lesson in not putting all of our emphasis on income, on measured income. This is a question that was asked on the very first day. When we talk about GDP, does that mean all we care about is material goods? When we look at things like income per capita, the data that we had in Table 12, the implicit assumption is that the only thing that matters to our utility function is that measured income per capita. But in fact, that's not true. There's more to our utility function. I hate to say it that way, but that's the way economists would say it. There's more to our individual and social utility function than simply the material standard of living. And this is one example of why looking simply at GDP numbers as a measure of the quality of life is a bad thing. Because here, given the choice to consume more freedom, individuals choose to do so. They choose, that is, to lower their labor supply. Yes, the result is a lower level of income, that is to say less cotton picked per person per year, but that's a trade-off people are willing to make. They could be producing household goods instead of producing for market. I think that's true. I think it's true that they could be, it's not like people are sitting around playing the banjo, right? Yeah, they could be doing other things. Yeah, okay. All right, second set of questions was why didn't income grow? The explanation for the slow growth, why it took a century for the South to recover its position vis-a-vis the United States, has 5 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is part 1. Part 1, the South had very little industry relative to the North. So on the eve of Civil War, 1850, 1860, if we look at the value added in manufacturing and we compare the South with the Northeast, the South has about 1/7. About 1/7, what is 1/7? 14%, as much manufacturing per person as does the Northeast. So the South is very heavily in agriculture. In 1880, over 75% of income in the South was a result of agriculture, whereas for the United States as a whole, about 25% of its income was from agriculture in 1880. So the South has very little industry. Why? Well, one reason has to be the lack of financial institutions. Go back and look at the maps about banking. The lack of banking in the South means that there's not a set of financial institutions which are channeling funds from savers to borrowers, that is, from savers to investors. And to expand manufacturing, to expand industry, there needs to be finance. There needs to be money that business people can borrow in order to build and to build their factories and to buy the equipment for their factories, because you don't have revenues before you produce. So you have to have borrowed money in order to build a factory and buy the machines with which you can produce goods, with which you can pay back the loans. In the absence of those financial institutions in the South, that process of channeling funds from savers to investors, that is people who are buying machines and buildings, is not happening in the South. Why didn't they have banks in the South? Because they had the cotton factors. Because the South was so heavily into cotton, and they had those agents, those men that were working the country, who had those one-on-one relationships. I mentioned the day that we did banking, who had the one-on-one relationships with the cotton farmers, and they were taking care of getting financing for the cotton farmers and helping the cotton farmers get their crops to market. Yes. So where does the financing that's in the South come from? The financing that's in the South is coming from the northern banks. That's right. That's right. But then you've got your asymmetric information problems, right? Because the northern banks are removed from what's happening in the South, and so you're not going to get as much lending in the South as you would if you had the lenders nearby, which would resolve some of those asymmetric information problems. All right. Second, less agricultural diversification over time. The South became actually more based in cotton after the Civil War, not less. They became less diversified. So if we compare here at Table 15 from last week in this week's handout, in 1860 versus 1880. In 1860, the corn output per capita was 29 bushels, falls to 17 bushels by 1880. Number of hogs per person, 1.8, falls to 1.0 by 1880. The South is becoming less diversified over time. This is a problem because the cotton market was saturated. During the Civil War, there's an embargo. You've seen Gone with the Wind? You've seen Gone with the Wind? How does Clark Gable plays Rhett Butler? Rhett Butler's making all his money, right, by whatever it's called, breaching the embargo, by running the ships around the embargo. That's how he's making all that money during the Civil War. Because there's an embargo. The United States Navy is blocking ships from going in and out of southern ports during the Civil War, which means during the Civil War, not only is the war taking place largely in the South, but the cotton that the South is growing, they're not able to export because of the embargo, which means now the world still wants cotton, and so during the Civil War, there's a big increase in cotton from India. So India, there's economic incentives for the cotton to start being grown in India because the worldwide demand for cotton can't be satisfied by the South because of the embargo, because of the Civil War. Yeah. So you get this increase in Indian, not United States Native American Indian, but Indian growth of cotton. British India growth of cotton. And the United States share of the world cotton market starts to go down. But the South was still growing cotton. They're actually getting more and more into cotton, not less and less into cotton, despite the economic incentives, which would say, look, if the world price of cotton is going down, then the southern farmers, if they were economically rational and free to choose, important, if they were economically rational and free to choose, the southern farmers would have moved away from cotton in the face of this competition from India. The cotton prices were going down because the world cotton market was saturated. That decrease in cotton price, in any kind of Econ 1 sort of analysis, should lead farmers to leave cotton and no longer be interested in growing cotton because they're not making as much profit there, should lead them to change the crop that they're growing and so they could get into some other crop that could be a more profitable crop. But they don't do it. The Southerners stick with cotton. So the question is why? Why do the Southerners stick with cotton? One reason, some economic historians argue, and there are others who disagree with this point, one reason that the Southerners stuck with cotton has to do with a system that some have called debt peonage. What debt peonage refers to is how that financial system was set up in the South. So we don't have banks, but yet farmers need credit. In the pre-Civil War periods, the large plantations had been getting their credit through these cotton factors, many of them agents for the big banks in England. What did they do after the Civil War? Patrick has a question. Number 3 was the cotton market was saturated. No problem. Okay, so what happens? The growers in the South need credit. Same as a business manufacturing goods, you need to buy your seed and plant your seed and grow your crops and harvest your crops, and then you sell your crops, and then you get your revenue. So you have to have credit in order to do all of the process of growing and harvesting your crops so that then you can sell the crop, get the revenue, pay back the loans that you took out or the credit that was extended to you, and hopefully have a little bit left over as profit. In the absence of any kind of organized banking system in the South, what develops in the South is a series of what's called merchant credit. These are stores, country stores, and the owner of the country store will extend credit to the farmer. So you're a farmer, you want to grow some cotton, you go down to the local country store, you go into the country store, you say, I need 1,000 pounds of seed, and they sell you 1,000 pounds of seed. You can't pay for it right then and there because you haven't grown the cotton and harvested it and sold it. So you're going to mark in the book that you have accepted 1,000 pounds of seed, and you're going to have to pay the merchant back at the end of the season once you sell your crop. The merchant, asymmetric information problems, the merchant wants to make sure that you're planting a crop that the merchant believes that you'll be able to sell at market. And so the merchant, who knows cotton really well, doesn't know hemp terribly well. That's what those folks up in Kentucky seem to be growing and smoking, right? Knows cotton really well. The merchant requires you to grow cotton. So you grow your cotton, you harvest your cotton, you sell your cotton. At the end of that process, the first thing, there's two things that are going to happen simultaneously. One of those things that's going to happen once you sell your crop is you're going to have to pay back the merchant. Now, who is it that's going to help you sell your crop? That same merchant. So the same merchant who extended you credit so you could buy the seed and whatever other supplies you may need for planting your crop is the same person who's going to help you market your crop. That is, it's going to help you get your crop to the market and get it sold. And so the merchant gets to take their share of your proceeds off of the top. But the second thing that's going to hurt is the sharecropping system. I showed you the map of what happened to Bennett Barrow's plantation and how Bennett Barrow's plantation was still being harvested, but not by Mr. Barrow, by all of these individuals who lived on Mr. Barrow's land. What was set up in the South was a series of what's called sharecropping, tenant farming. An individual who wanted to be a farmer would not own the land that they farmed. They would essentially rent it. But once again, you can't pay the rent up front, right? If you have an apartment off campus, you got to pay your rent on the first of the month. If you're renting land, farmland, you have to wait until you have harvested your crop and sold your crop until you can pay your landlord. And so what the landlord says is, here's what we're going to do. We will share the crop that you grow. I'll take half of the proceeds from your crop, and you take half of the proceeds from your crop. And so when you go to the merchant who had extended credit to you so that you could buy the seed, and have the merchant help you market the crop, and what happens to the money? Let me make up some numbers. Suppose that you sold your cotton, and you got $200 in revenue from selling your cotton. First thing that happens is $100 of it goes to the landowner, the person that you are renting your land from. That leaves you with $100. Out of that remaining $100, you have to pay back the merchant. And then whatever's left over goes to you. So suppose that you had bought seed and other supplies, and you had received credit for $80 from the merchant. Then that merchant gets their $80, and voila, out of your $200, you're left with $20. And that's your net revenue for the year. What the sharecropping system means is that the owner of the land gets half of your revenue, but who's paying the merchant? Is the landowner paying the merchant? No. The landowner is not paying for any of the inputs. The landowner gets half of the value of your crop, but doesn't have to pay half of what you owe the merchant. Doesn't have to pay for half of the seed. Doesn't have to pay for half of any improvements that you make to the land. And what that means is that for any improvement that you make to the land to be profitable, it has to have at least twice the usual rate of return, because the landowner is going to take half of your revenue right off the top. And so if you say, well, if I put $10, if I invest $10 in my land, it's going to increase my total revenue by $15. And you think, that's a pretty good return, 15 over 10? It's pretty good. Not so good. Because out of that $15 improvement that you just got, $7.50 of it's going to the landowner. So you made a $10 investment and you're only getting back $7.50. You're not covering the cost of your investment. So investments had to be twice as good in order for them to be profitable, which means that you get a very low level of investment in the land. What's the pattern of cropping? Here's the pattern of cropping. The darker the county, the higher the share of land that's being cropped. And you can see that here in our Piedmont region, there's a high preponderance of cropping. And here in what's now in Texas, there's also a high preponderance of cropping. There's cropping throughout the area. Yeah. So the question is, why didn't the merchants realize that cotton was not the most profitable? There's an aggregation problem here. So any individual merchant may recognize that for the economy as a whole, cotton may not be the most profitable, but what that individual merchant knows is cotton. And so they want to stick with what they know and hope that everybody else changes their behavior. Why was it a 50-50 split? This just seemed to be the, I don't know why, and I don't know work that's been done. I'm not sure, I'm not saying it hasn't been done on why, but it seemed that most of the contracts are 50-50 contracts. So, yep. I'm sorry, louder. The bank, so real quick, the questions about banks and why weren't the banks in the South. So when I talk about banking, next week or the week after, the banks that are created, so during the Civil War, the South is out, the National Banking Act is passed. There are provisions of that which encourage banks to change from having state charters to having a federal charter, which I'll talk about in 2 weeks. But under a federal charter, which means it being a national bank, national banks are prohibited from lending on agriculture and farm real estate. And so the national bank system is designed to encourage industrialization. It's not designed to be a system that encourages an expansion of farming. And since the South is primarily farming, there's not much for them to do. Okay. All right, what's the lesson? The takeaway from the story about the South after the Civil War is that institutions matter. We had a series of institutions here that led to extremely slow growth in the South. In our production function, where are the institutions? What letter? A, that's right. So those institutions that are caught up in that A, that total factor productivity, make a difference. And we see that difference when we study the postbellum South. The slavery and its aftermath, slavery has an effect, the racism that results from slavery has an effect on education. There's very low literacy in the South, and there's very little support for schooling, publicly financed schooling. We're going to talk about education in a couple of 3 weeks. The land tenure system, the disincentive to improve the land, which results from having a land ownership system where the land ownership is concentrated in the hands of the whites and the cropping is concentrated in the black population, a legacy of slavery. Having a credit system, and we'll talk more, I forget when, around, this is spring, so we have spring break in spring, right? So around spring break or so, I'm going to talk about a paper I did on racial differences in credit use and the difference in the ability of whites and blacks to get credit during this period. All of this is is one of the legacies of slavery. In addition to that, the lack of financial institutions makes a difference in terms of the South's ability to recover after the Civil War. The types of credit institutions, the way in which that merchant credit system functioned, makes a difference in terms of the South's ability to recover after the Civil War. The land holding systems make a difference in terms of the South's ability to recover following the Civil War. Institutions matter. All right, that's the South. What about the North? So we've done a day and a half, 2 days practically on Southern farming, talked a lot about cotton, talked about slavery, talked about factors that led up to Civil War, talked about the postbellum South. We talked only briefly about the North, contrasting the inequality in the ownership of land in the South with the more equal, not equal, but more equal distribution of land in the North. We're going to talk now, I've got 26 minutes, good, talk about postbellum Northern agriculture. Usually the midterm falls right at this moment, and not having any postbellum stuff in the midterm, but I didn't want to have a midterm on the day after a 3-day weekend, so that's why I'm here today and the midterm's on Thursday. So hopefully that was a good decision. All right, Northern agriculture. What do we get? Table 17 from last week's handout. So this is looking at this is actually for the United States as a whole, looking at the numbers of farms and farmers. And we peak in terms of the numbers of farms in this country 1910, 1920. So we're getting increases in the number of farms throughout the postbellum period. The number of acres that are being farmed is increasing, peaks again 1910, 1920. The number of people who are in farming is increasing, peaks again 1910, 1920. The number of people who are gainfully employed in agriculture, again, growing, peaks again 1910, 1920. For comparison, in the year 2000, even though the population of the United States in the year 2000 is vastly greater than the population of 1920, we have 1/3 as many farms